Good morning, River Rocks Church. This is Patrick Dyer. I'm with the SALT group this year, and today I'm going to be going through the devotional with you today for Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. To give you some background here, just remember that Paul here is writing to the church in Philippi as he's in jail awaiting his sentence. He's writing to the Philippian Christians specifically to give them thanks because they had demonstrated so much of God's grace and kindness and devotion to him as he helped them begin their church in the beginning phases and throughout the rest of his time in prison. So here, let's begin with verse 6. This is from the New King James Version. Being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. So what Paul here is talking about is when he says being confident of this very thing. First of all, when we say this very thing, he's referring to a statement he made in the previous verse, verse 5, where he says fellowship in the gospel. So this is Paul assuring the church in Philippi that they were heading in the right direction because they had demonstrated that fellowship in the gospel. This is especially important because back then, early churches then were, as they were starting to emerge, they were probably having a lot of concerns about whether or not they were on the right track. I'm sure they must have had tons of questions like, are we teaching the right things? Are we really demonstrating God's qualities to a world that is in need of a Savior and a Lord? Are we treating each other well? Are we demonstrating anything else that, and all other kinds of important aspects of Christianity to the world? But Paul here is reassuring the Philippians that they are because they've embodied the grace of God. And they've demonstrated over and over again. And this is, of course, demonstrated very clearly in Acts chapter 16. Now, this is also really important because the Philippian church historically was the first church that was established in the continent of Europe. So obviously this church was going to have a huge role in the spread of Christianity throughout European Christendom later on in history. Paul's main message to the Philippians here is that when we accept the grace of God in our hearts, that is the beginning of the good work, or the spreading of the gospel to the world. But that work doesn't stop simply when we accept Jesus Christ into our hearts. In fact, it's meant to go on until what Paul says is the day of Jesus Christ, or the second coming. So if we are truly followers of Christ, we must demonstrate his grace in every aspect of our lives. So Paul here is emphasizing this again because the Philippians had demonstrated a gracious attitude towards him. And this was something that Paul himself relied upon very heavily from his time when he began the church all the way up to his imprisonment. That gave him a great deal of encouragement to see the Philippians who were demonstrating God's grace like right from the start, immediately. This is obviously going to be very important for the spread of Christianity even later, further on. So to kind of learn from the Philippians in order to have that fellowship in the gospel and to demonstrate God's grace to a world in need of a Savior and a Lord, how exactly can we do the same thing today in our world? Well, a lot of that really just comes down to sharing the gospel and building fellowship with those who are willing to hear it. So obviously you would start the day by sharing what you've discovered in the Word with people that you love, your family or your friends. Share it with your coworkers at your job, and share it with your fellow brothers and sisters at church. In fact, when you're at church, a huge thing to ask yourself is, just like with the Philippian church, is the grace of God felt everywhere? Is the grace of God apparent and right there from the very start? When people first walk in, do they feel that God is in the room? So our devotion to the gospel isn't simply meant for, like the congregation hall or simply the sanctuary space. It's also meant for the fellowship hall. It's also meant for the cookout area. It's also meant for when you're talking with someone at the coffee table. But the big thing to make sure it's at the front entrance. When people walk through the front doors of your church, do they feel the presence of God right then and there? In fact, and maybe another question to ask yourself is if Paul were to attend your church, would he tell you afterwards, as he told the Philippians, that he is confident in your work? So my prayer for all of you today is for you to be confident with the good work that God is doing in your hearts through the gospel. And remember, the gospel is not just the good news, it's the best news. So live according to it every day of your lives. So thanks so much for watching,